first episode of Frame by Frame Season 2, picture editor Jay Rabinowitz, sound editor Chic Ciccolini, and re-recording mixer Dominick Tavella talk about their craft and process in collaborating with filmmaker Jim Jarmusch on his films Coffee and Cigarettes, Night on Earth, and Ghost Dog.
I don't know how many people I've talked to now don't realize that 90-something% of the sound is created out of whole cloth.
I refer to what we do in sound just like a chef who has an array of spices. How he combines them creates his unique dish.
What is the atmosphere? What's surrounding the scene? What's going on around the dialogue that creates the world and puts the viewer of a film in the scene?
Frame by Frame is brought to you in partnership with Motion Picture Editors Guild and Post New York Alliance, because it's how you finish that counts. Our website is postnewyork.org, and we can be found on Twitter at @postny. Our host for today's session is Soundtrack. I'm your host, Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame, a podcast introduction to the most influential and respected film professionals working in New York today, celebrating the iconic films and filmmakers that continue to make New York an essential center of the global film industry. Back in 1985, just after graduating from NYU, picture editor Jay Rabinowitz started as an intern with filmmaker Jim Jarmusch. Since then, he and Jim Jarmusch have collaborated on 9 films. He's also worked as an editor with directors such as Darren Aronofsky, Paul Schrader, Todd Haynes, and Terrence Malick. I asked Jay to talk about the progression that led him and Jim Jarmusch to collaborate with sound editor Chic Ciccolini and re-recording mixer Dominick Tavella.
It was a whole transition for us. As Jim and Melody came out of NYU graduate school, and they pretty much made Stranger Than Paradise in Jim's kitchen. And then when I got on board in 85 with Down by Law, that was already for them a progression. We were cutting at the Brill Building. We were cutting at Sound One. Still, we had sound editors that had gone to school with them, a guy named John Auerbach and Frank Kern, who Frank continues to work in sound to this day. But each step of the way, there was a progression. On Mystery Train, we met up with Bob Hine, and Bob did the sound for us on that. And we were always sort of learning more and more, but Jim's take was always from, he had no preconceived notion of what a soundtrack was supposed to be. And so he was coming in fresh with his own sort of view of how things could be, or how things, how his film might sound. And
it was the same thing with editing.
Very much so. So all of those progressions, I think, were very interesting. To see Stranger Than Paradise was one scene, one shot, a kind of a protege of Mitsuguchi, but to see the picture editing evolve, to see the sound editing involved when we started to collaborate with people like Dom and Chic and Bob Hine and Tony Vellante, it was fascinating for us all to sort of evolve.
I asked Jay to talk more about the evolution of his relationship with Jim and the dynamic they share that's led to 9 successful collaborations.
I started working for Jim Jarmusch in 1985, more or less fresh out of school. I was at NYU undergraduate and, was poking around for a while, trying to figure out how to break into the editing world, and wound up interning on Down by Law and really learned everything I needed to know about working in a cutting room on that film. Melody was the editor on Down by Law, which I interned, and then sort of over the course of that job, the appellation of intern sort of shifted over to apprentice. And once that job was over, I was able to join the union, having apprenticed on a film. We cut Down by Law in one of the few post-production centers. At that time, there was really just a few places where cutting was done. They had to be centralized so you could get transfers and be near the lab for dailies and stuff. We were at Sound One.
Everything was kind of Times Square, because you had
very much
Magno, Sound One.
Trans Audio at the time.
Yeah, that was on 54th Street.
And they had a mixing studio. Yeah. After Down by Law, actually, when he came back around a few years later to make Mystery Train, they invited me to be the assistant editor on that. And that's when I sort of fell into this routine of working on Jim's films and filling in with whatever other interesting things might come up between them. I did another gig at the Brill Building at Sound One which was Dead of Winter with Arthur Penn. And then I did one at Transaudio, which was The Glass Menagerie that Paul Newman directed. And we wound up mixing that with Dick Voracek, one of the last pictures that he mixed. And I cut Foley for Bob on Alice, the Woody Allen picture, which was great for me to start to understand a little bit more about sound, a little bit more about how the whole post-production operation worked. And then when it came time for the next one, Night on Earth, he asked me to cut that for him, and that was a huge break for me. And I from very early on, from the time he got home from New Orleans in 85, 86, after shooting Down by Law, and I started to get to know him, there was a kind of he felt like a brother, not just in terms of filmmaking or even in terms of music, but just in terms of in life. He gave me my confidence as an editor. You know, I was pretty young when I started working with him, and he saw something in me, and he believed in me, and it really gave me a feeling that I could do this. There was a great moment for me. I can't remember which film it was on. I think it was on Night on Earth, but there was a film that came out called Straight No Chaser about Thelonious Monk, and in that film, you get a sense that Charlie Rouse, who worked with Monk, really supported him and helped him achieve his vision. And I always felt as an editor on all the films I've ever done as part of a kind of a jazz ensemble, and I brought the editing part of it. And it's a collaboration and an improvisation, and you sort of figure it out as you go. And you know, one of the things that happens at the mix is that things will get very loud, and Dominick will be working on something and kind of massaging it, and it was like magic to watch that happen. But also as part of that process, sometimes things would go silent, and you know, very infrequently, but once in a while, there would be a visitor at the mix, and one night this happened, and he was sort of telling someone about me. And his relationship with me and how it worked. And Dominick was mixing away, and we were all sort of oblivious. Jim was talking to a friend or something, but I think he was telling them this story about Straight No Chaser and Charlie Rouse's relationship to Monk. And all of a sudden, Dom had to rewind or pause or stop for a second, and things got very quiet. And Jim said, "Jay's kind of like my Charlie Rouse," in the middle of this silence, and I just fucking died. I just really thought, like, that's kind of how I feel, and it's awfully nice to hear that he feels the same. It was an accident that kind of spilled out that way, and that has always sort of defined it for me.
The first collaboration that brought Jay, Chic, and Dom together was Jim Jarmusch's Night on Earth in 1991.
Night on Earth was cut on film, but this was the beginning of the digital age, and Eugene had you know, started to make that possible for us, and hearing things in the lead up to the mix was a great blessing for us.
No
in the same way that
were we working with Sonic Solutions at that time?
Not then. Not yet.
Not yet. No, Synclavier.
Yeah.
Synclavier.
All the dialogue was all edited traditionally. With
Yeah, I think
Meg
Sonic didn't come in until Dead Man.
94.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Dead Man was the first thing we did with Sonic.
And as we were sort of wrapping up the picture editing part of that job, that's when we met Chic and eventually hooked up with Dom as well.
Re-recording mixer Dominick Tavella has mixed over 300 films, including collaborations with directors such as Jim Jarmusch, the Coen brothers, Spike Lee, Lasse Hallström, Ken Burns, Julian Schnabel, Paul Schrader, Wes Anderson, Hayao Miyazaki, Mira Nair, Barry Levinson, Darren Aronofsky, and Martin Scorsese. When he first met Jim Jarmusch, he was making his way as a young mixer at New York's Duart Labs.
At the beginning, when Jim came in with his first film, Permanent Vacation, I was at Duart Film Labs, and he ended up mixing it with our student mixer, for lack of a better term, you know, for like some ridiculous sum, like $20 an hour. I remember somehow connecting with him and connecting with the film, just keeping in touch, for the next 2 or 3 films, Down by Law and Mystery Train, I'd be doing dailies for him, transferring stuff like that, do an occasional temp mix or, a quick little dirty thing for him to screen. But I just remember thinking constantly, it's like, I want to mix this man's films. I want to mix this man's films. The quality of his films and his approach to making them, they've always been sort of unconventional in that they're kind of like a slice of life or reality. They kind of float. It's not like they move with a steady plot, A, B, C, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. They just kind of float from moment to moment. And he does them so well. It was so very compelling. I said, this guy is just, what a filmmaker, boy. I would just love to work on his stuff. And, just finally, Night on Earth was the first one. He tapped me and said, okay, come on and mix it. And I've basically been doing all his films since.
Chic Ciccolini began as a sound editor in 1980 and was quickly recognized by directors such as Alan Pakula, Ron Howard, and Jim Jarmusch, among many others. In his first meeting with Jim Jarmusch and Jay Rabinowitz, Chic talks about how he made a strong first impression.
Back in 1991, I had gotten a call to meet Jim and Jay and interview for the position of sound editor on the job. So at the time, I was going through a divorce. And as a matter of fact, the day that I had this interview, my divorce was final. I was dressed appropriately for the courts. And then I came to Sound One to meet Jim and Jay. So I knock on their door, and Jim answers the door. So he looks at me, and I'm in a suit, which, of course, that doesn't really it ended like in the 60s, people wearing jackets and ties. Yeah, so he goes to me, he says, you just come from a wedding? So I said, no, actually a divorce. So he got a kick out of that. So based on that, we kind of hit it off,
But it was really amazing because we really lucked out because we had met 2 great sound designers, Chic and Bob Hine, and we kind of alternated for a little while, and because we loved both of them, and they both brought wonderful, amazing artistry to what we were trying to do. But on that one, it was tricky because Bob had done Mystery Train, but Bob has a centuries-old relationship with Woody Allen, and there was a conflict on Night on Earth, so we got to meet Chic, and we got to work with Chic, and it was spectacular for us because we like to keep a certain amount of levity. We're not like poet philosophers trying to make some deep piece of work. We're trying to do something that's engaging and fun. And at the same time, I think for Jim, somewhat naturally, this kind of poetic element comes through. But Chic really brought us a kind of a fun, a kind of a levity that was great for us. It was important for us.
I loved it when he laughed.
It was
when Jim laughed,
And there's nothing he likes more than to laugh. You know what I mean? Like he's as we've said ad infinitum. There's a vision and there's a poetry, but the laughing and the fun and the camaraderie and we would be remiss if we didn't bring up the inimitable Tony Grocki.
Oh,
God, yes.
Tony Grocki was my assistant starting on Night on Earth, and again, somewhat like Chic on some weird level, brought a kind of levity. He knew what we were doing was serious and it was important to us, but he also knew it was important for us to have fun and to keep it light and sort of fleet of foot. And it was helpful. It really was. It was helpful for all of us. And I think that's an important point. Like, we were never like sitting there going, we're making a great work of art.
No.
We were just like having fun, trying to make something cool, trying to make something engaging, trying to make something that we could relate to. And I think comedy is the vital through line of all of his films,
But it's a very natural comedy, though. It's not like, joke.
Yeah,
hey,
exactly.
2 guys walk into a bar, that kind of stuff.
In sitting down with Jay and Jim, I could tell that, Jim was not a conventional director, being the writer of his movies, is very particular about his dialogue, and that's most important. And so the design of A Night on Earth, which was interesting, there are 5 stories that basically happen at the same time in different parts of the world: LA, New York, Paris, Rome, Helsinki. So the beginning of each of those stories had a montage of what Jim referred to as the uglies. And that was the opportunity to do a sound montage with the visuals and basically creating unique sounds for each city and also for each cab that takes place in each of the cities. So we built a character of sorts. And the guys, when they were driving, they were being towed. So there was no engine sounds, which was a great thing because it gave us the opportunity to, create our own sounds, as you will. This was my first opportunity of actually working digitally. Gene Garrity, who was my sound effects editor, he was working in a synclavier, and we had a room on the 3rd floor at Sound One where we went and we spent weeks. And when we had something together, then we called Jim and Jay and have them come in. And it was great because prior to that, our tracks were all built, and the only way you were going to get a chance to hear it all is at the mix, where all the elements are up on dubbers and you're playing it back through the console. So this was wonderful because we had multiple tracks and we could play everything and set levels that were, needed to be refined, obviously, but at least it gave Jim and Jay, because they hadn't heard anything, just the dialogue and maybe some music, right?
Yep.
And in my world of sound, dialogue is always first, music comes in as a second, and third is your sound effects. So the music was an important element to this movie. But when we did play back the sound effects for Jim and Jay, we played a reel and we waited and there was nothing. Jay didn't say anything. Jim didn't say anything. And I'm like, are we doing the right thing or what? And let me see it again. And Jim really used Jay as a sounding board. I mean, Jay was his main man, because it was the first time he was hearing anything. And after about 3 or 4 passes, he finally said, "Yeah, this is pretty good. I think this is good, right?" And it was like, at least we knew that he was on board with our way of thinking. And the concept of the uglies, you remember that we would do our montage of sounds during that period and just spot in sound effects here and there to kind of keep you in the frame of mind of where you were in New York or in LA. We had helicopters in LA, we had horn honks and sirens and what have you in New York. And the characteristic of the taxi in New York was great because it was one of these shit bombs that sputtered and
he didn't know how to drive it.
Well, that's right. Armand Stahlmuller was the driver of the cab, and he just wasn't getting it, so it was this jerky kind of thing, and Giancarlo Esposito was the passenger.
Let me drive.
What a character. I mean, talking about how things just kind of evolve in the story. I mean, it was Jim's genius in terms of getting it going. He got the right people to be in the movie. Everyone was a gem. Rosie Perez, and then the LA scene with Jenna Rollins and Winona Ryder. A really interesting contrast there between the two of them, and constantly with the cigarettes in the mouth, and she was a trip. Once he was familiar, once he heard these sounds over and over again, he became comfortable with it. It wasn't anything outlandish. I did one thing, as a matter of fact, and we got a laugh. It was in the New York Uglies, and they were driving through this area, and you're hearing, people shouting, and a gunshot goes off, and Jim says, "No, I don't know." He got a kick out of it, because it was very much the uglies of this area, but we did away with the gunshot.
There's an authenticity to everything he does. Oh, Chick can tell you about that with the fucking woodpecker.
Oh, the pileated woodpecker. He goes, is that a pileated woodpecker? It's a woodpecker. It's making noise, you know. He goes, no. It's got to be a pileated woodpecker. It's got to be like Woody Woodpecker.
Well, he's a real bird nut too.
Yeah, and I totally appreciate that. I try to sneak one by because finding a pileated woodpecker wasn't easy. I wound up having to go to one of the universities, Cornell. Thank you.
Cornell Ornithology Lab.
Yep. That was it. Yeah. So I wound up getting the pileated woodpecker, and he was happy.
Sound is kind of invisible in the sense, because I don't know how many people I've talked to, like relatives, things like that, who say they just basically thought, they just, stuck a mic up and, the sound was just whatever's there is what was there, and don't realize that 90-something% of that sound is created out of whole cloth. It doesn't exist. I mean, guys like Chic put together a soundscape. I mean, the street and or an apartment or whatever, an office, and there's a lot of little layers of in and out of sounds coming in and out.
Layers. That's it.
Right,
layers.
Right.
I always refer to sound as the building of layers of sound.
Right.
I also refer
Jim
to
will
it.
love that.
I refer to what we do in sound because many of us have very similar sound effects in our library. And just like a chef who has an array of spices and herbs and what have you, but yet, how he combines them creates his unique dish. And so, in a sense, that's what we do with our sound. One of the things that came to mind on A Night on Earth is in France. Isaac is driving, I don't remember her name, but she's a blind woman, and she tells him that she wants to go a certain way, and he thinks that because she's blind, that he can do what he wants. And so we created this atmosphere, once again, where he goes through a tunnel. And so we created this sound so that, it just gradually went from this exterior ambience with the car to this tunnel.
That's a great example. It's a great example of what you do.
Yeah.
And really, not just in that specific example, but it's as much a part of the world as the visuals. It's on an equal footing with the visuals. No question about it. And that flows through now. And that's a specific example where there's kind of a narrative reason for that to be important.
Right.
But the fact is, it's important in every scene. It's important in every scene. What is the atmosphere? What's surrounding the scene? What's going on around the dialogue that creates the world and puts the viewer of a film in the scene?
Right.
And so it's specifically true in that case, and it has a narrative point, but it's true in every other scene you've ever cut sound for.
The best kind of sound is sound you don't notice.
Yeah, in a way. They say that about editing too, and most of the time
but that's
true.
also true.
Not always, but most of the time.
Right. Well, the same thing with sound, but it's like you have a big effects film and you have like 40,000 spaceships shooting and bang, 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 bang. That's one thing, but if you just have two people walking down the street and talking, you have to be careful with every horn beep, every car going by, every door that's opening to a store, every person that's walking by on the street, their footsteps, whether they're talking. Because every little bit you want to be there because you want it to feel like it's a street, but you want to make it such that they're never taking away from what you want to. Exactly. So
it's never right. It should never be a distraction.
Exactly.
It should always be supporting the environment of the scene.
Right.
And that's when it's at its best. Which is not to say it's easy, because subtlety is not easy.
Right.
It's harder.
Oh, I always thought that quiet dialogue scenes, two people talking to each other in a bedroom, with very little going on outside. That's so much harder to mix effectively and to really make it sound good than it is like a big battle scene. I mean, just in terms of simple things, for instance, like a voice of someone talking. Are they authoritative? Are they laid back? Are they strong? Are they weak? You know, they're just very, very small, subtle equalization changes to things like that will make a voice seem more authoritative or laid back or anything else. So you have to very carefully see how these people are talking and what their emotional relationship is to the scene and the structure of the scene. And it's subtle stuff, and it's stuff that, I mean, even if you point it out to people, they're not necessarily going to notice it as such, but it does make a big difference because a lot of this stuff is subconscious almost. I mean, you can see what's happening on the screen, and kind of like intellectually you can grasp what you can see, but it's much harder to grasp intellectually what you're hearing. First of all, because you don't really understand what you're hearing in the sense of you don't understand the structure and what's gone into it. And secondly, very, very small, minute differences make a large difference in how you perceive it. I mean, I'll talk to people all the time, and they'll say, you know, you've been working on this scene for 4 hours. It sounds exactly the same as it did 4 hours ago. So, like, well, no, it doesn't. You know, if you watch the scene 4 hours ago and you watch the scene now, and you stop to think about it, you realize that there's a difference. But the trick is you don't ever want people to stop and think about it. You want it just to flow into them. And, you know, and like I said before, since sound is, in a sense, invisible, it's, in a way, more difficult, and it's harder to just get it to sit right because it is kind of invisible.
Well, A Night on Earth in particular is one that does that, you know, by introducing each story with a montage of
yeah, it kind of sets you up for what the sound is going to be for that particular environment.
To play with it, you know, to take on, give that particular city a character. Because once you're inside the cab, now you're focused on the dialogue that exists between the people in the cab. And then, of course, what you do is you sprinkle in from here and there when there were these pauses that allowed you to do that.
Right, right. So if you're in L.A., you always know you're in L.A. in terms of the sound.
Yeah.
But in a subtle way. And if you're in Finland, you always know you're in Finland in terms of what the sound is. But, you know, it's not like, boom, Finland, we're going to have nothing but wind and snow. And L.A., boom, we're going to have nothing but, you know, cars passing by and gunshots. But it's a matter of sculpting it very carefully, such that you create an environment, an oral environment, that's always there for the particular place you're in.
It was a real nice opportunity for you guys to do that, you know, because the Uglies created that visually, and the soundtrack sort of had to match that, and it did in its beautifully subtle way, and then that could be called upon to support the scene as it played out.
What I like about working with Dominick is that he was the dominator, right? He was the dominator.
Matter of fact, Jim gave me that nickname. I think Night on Earth, he'd just look at a scene and then he'd look at me and say, okay, dominate this scene.
Yep. And
somehow I got known as the Dominator, and he actually, in every one of his films that I've done, it's Dominick the Dominator Tavella. Yeah. And he's the only one I've ever let use that. I don't let anybody else use that except him.
That's the thing that I loved about Jim, is that he really did appreciate our contribution to his work, and that's a good thing. You know, there's some directors don't know what they want.
There's also a lot of directors just don't care. I mean, you're just basically hired to press buttons.
Yeah, keep things in sync.
Do it this way, do it that way. Yeah, it's fine. You know.
But Jim really liked getting into the thing.
Well, for him, it was this whole creative kind of stew. Everybody in the room, you know, it's like just have an idea, speak it, and he'd listen to everything. And you know, some ideas were stupid, and some he'd take, and some but everything was open to discussion and thinking about, and which direction should we go in. It was more than just about anybody else I've ever worked with. It was about as collaborative an effort making a soundtrack for one of Jim's films as any I've ever done.
Jim was very complimentary because he said to me that he considers sound to be 50% of the movie. Other directors are not that,
Yeah, you hear the dialogue, you're fine. Whatever.
Yeah. But in his mind, that was without good sound, without the right sound, it makes the film not work for him, And by the same token, too, if something wasn't working for him, he said it, it doesn't work. He challenges you, which
Not shy.
which I totally respect. And for the films that I
But
did,
never in an obnoxious way. Never.
No,
You
definitely
sucked.
not.
You did this wrong. You're a
No,
fucking idiot.
no. Never did that.
Never
Never did
anything
that.
like that.
Well,
no, but
He might have said it, but he didn't mean it.
he was good, and it made me, especially that challenge about the pileated woodpecker. I made sure that in the future movies that I did, wherever the movie took place, that birds and particular sounds are indigenous to that location. I'm not going to...
Oh, no, I have to say, in the absence of Bob Hine, who could have been here tonight as well.
Yes, he's another...
we took that to extraordinary lengths on Dead Man.
Oh, yeah.
Because Dead Man was a film that proceeded across many landscapes.
Started in
many
Cleveland and
environments.
worked all the way to the West Coast.
Bob did an enormous amount of research to make sure that the birdage was
every
appropriate
bug,
to
every
the
bird.
environment. And we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of great filmmakers, production designers, cinematographers, sound designers, sound mixers, sound recorders. I mean, musicians, actors, obviously across the board. But on something like Ghost Dog, and we talked a little bit about Dead Man as well, and on Down by Law and Mystery Train as well, we had the opportunity to work with really one of the most visionary directors of photography who ever lived, Robbie Mueller, and that created almost like a pictorial equivalent to the audio landscape that we're talking about, and it is kind of trippy, but it's immersive.
Right.
And I remember on Dead Man, because when you're initially working on mixing the film, at least back in the day, you would have fairly cheap and low quality prints that you would work with, because you're going back and forth, and you beat the shit out of them, so they didn't want to have really high quality
black and white dupes.
But I remember the first answer print of Dead Man, and I remember and this was Mueller shot it. I remember thinking when looking at the first answer print that it was so sharp and so clear that it hurt my eyes to watch it. It was just spectacular.
That shot of the were they birch trees or?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, when they were going to
what
the
a
forest,
trip that was, as far as the eye could see.
The bark was all peeling off.
Yeah, wow.
Robbie said to Jim, the trees have eyes, because the knots in the trees look very much like eyes. Was very, very beautiful. Robbie worked with Wim Wenders, and in 1984, I believe, Stranger Than Paradise was at Cannes, and Paris, Texas was at Cannes. And Jim and Wim and Robbie, I think, were all started to become part of a similar circle, because Jim had been a teaching assistant for Nicholas Ray, and Wim made a film about Nicholas Ray called Lightning Over Water. Anyway, over the course of that process in the early and mid 80s, they got to know each other, and then Jim and Robbie got together and first worked together on Down by Law, and then Mystery Train and Dead Man and Ghost Dog, and some of the most spectacular film photography that you're really ever going to see.
Jim kind of got that out of people. I mean,
that's right.
He was somehow managed. Well, somehow we all know how he did it, but he would get more out of you than you thought you had in you.
Because I think they all, like we were talking about Jim, so the three of us schmucks sitting here saying, "Hey, Jim's an interesting guy and he has an interesting vision," and so we all kind of gave ourselves over to that. But that also happened with Robbie, and that happened with actors, and that happened with a lot of people who just wanted to throw in and say, like, man, whatever you're after, it's intriguing, and I want to come along.
Being a collaborator over so many years, I asked Jay to talk about the role of music in Jim Jarmusch's films.
I think music was an enormous influence on him as a filmmaker and on us in the cutting room when we're making the films. It's often something that is in place from the earliest days of script writing. You know, Jim, I think, imagined Crazy Horse music from the very inception of the film Dead Man. And in all of his films, music just plays a key role, not only the specific music in terms of the source music that's going to be in the film and in terms of the score that's going to be done for the film, but also just in terms of the filmmaking itself, the musicality of the process of editing and the process of mixing. You know, it's the soundscape and the music and the sound effects and the dialogue are all part of this flow, and I think it all comes from a deep-seated connection to music itself. And he's a musician as well, and I think
his stuff is cut very musically. It flows.
Yeah, I mean that was always
musically.
the goal. That was always the goal. We sort of bonded over music, and I think we bonded a bit in the musicality of cutting his particular films, and I mean he did come up, you know, in the mid to late 70s out of the punk rock scene. And I think that attitude also lent itself to his filmmaking. He has a very non-hierarchical approach. So if someone's an intern or if someone's a sound mixer...
On that point, he almost never has a music editor. On most films, they'll have someone specifically to cut the music. But he would cut the music along with Jay. You know,
I even did it on Coffee and Cigarettes. And I'll never forget when I was taking source music and cutting it to fit the various vignettes. He couldn't get over how I did what I did, you know. And he says, "Hey, you took out the heart of the matter," you know. I said, "Well, you need a beginning, a middle, and an end," and that's what I did. I figured it out, you know. It was funny. You know, but
in Coffee and Cigarettes, as Chick was saying, there was a different piece of source music for almost every one, and a different flavor, and a different rhythm, and a different style, and a different tone, and it just deeply influenced everything we did.
But you guys also designed the film. In other words, there are movies that are wall-to-wall music, and Jim was not that at all. He had his areas where music played an important part, and then it would.
And the music was very structurally important to what he was doing in that scene when he had it. It never was music just for the sake of music.
Right, exactly. There was a purpose. And then he would go into the dialogue and tell the story, and even with actors that ad-libbed, because a lot of the Coffee and Cigarettes were ad-libs.
Well,
with a structure, with a design.
Some. I mean, I think the actors were involved in the writing process. So, you know, he would come up with these scenarios, and he always writes for specific people.
Right.
And then he would involve them, and then that was true of Ghost Dog as well. Forrest got involved a little bit in what that character was like and how he behaved, and it brought some really wonderful things to that. So he definitely incorporated the actors in sort of almost in the writing process in terms of coming to understand the characters and what drove them. And he always writes for specific actors. It helps him, I think, envision the character, and he involves them just like he involves us, you know. And again, it's not to imply that he's not at the helm. There's no question he's at the helm. He's just not a dictator. He's just not an authoritarian. It's not part of his personality. So there's this openness that allows interesting things to happen. We wanted to embrace this unique approach because it lent itself to what we were doing. And so mixing at night and, you know, I mean, God, there's 1,000 stories. When we had Neil Young in for Dead Man, it was
that was funny.
Amazing.
I was doing the dialogue premix at the time. And Jim, when you're doing dialogue premix, what you're doing is you're kind of arranging, you're dealing with a lot of technical problems, technical issues. So a lot of times the director really isn't around because you don't want him sitting there while you're spending 20 minutes trying to get rid of camera noise, that kind of stuff.
But it's imperative
So
because it makes the dialogue sing, and it makes it easy on the ear. It's a very, very important part of the process.
Exactly. But the point is, I was working 9 to 6 regular days during the dialogue premix process. And Neil Young came in. He was supposed to come in like on a Thursday or something, but he ended up showing up Wednesday. at like 4 in the afternoon. All right, and I'd been working from 9 in the morning. So about 4 in the afternoon, Neil comes in. So we start screwing around with his music and playing around with stuff. And it's about midnight, working until about midnight. And I'm getting really tired because I've been there from 9. And I'm saying, like, I'm going to turn around and say, maybe we should, stop this. And just before I said anything, Neil picks up the phone, calls up Carnegie Deli, orders a big platter of beans and franks. And I said, okay, we're going to be here for a while.
I mean, this was after just an incredible process of securing Neil, commandeering Neil to do the music for this movie, convincing him that he could do it and should do it, even though he when he finally saw the movie and saw it with some of his music temped in, he realized how special it was, and he jumped in,
And that was one of the highlights of my life.
Oh, no, same here.
Neil Young was like,
Same here. But this moment that you're describing came after, just a few days before that. Jim and I were out in San Francisco recording that music. And it was just a few days before that where he agreed to do it. And the great Larry Johnson, L.A. Johnson, Neil's audiovisual specialist, arranged the whole thing. And we took it was still kind of a rough cut at that point, running probably about 2.5 hours. And we took it out to San Francisco, and Larry Johnson orchestrated this incredible recording scenario with a mobile recording truck in the alley and surrounded Neil with 6 or 8 monitors so he could see the film. We recorded the score live to the movie and then brought it back and had to sort of take these 3 takes that we had recorded with Neil covering the entire movie.
Right.
And
they basically would run the entire length of the movie nonstop,
right.
And Neil would perform to the entire length of the movie.
And then we made 3 copies of the film, one with each of these takes, and gave a set to Jim and a set to Neil, and they watched them and they made some notes, and then we sort of showed up at Dom's doorstep and said, we have these 3 takes, we need to mix them together. It's like a music premix in some way, and we came into Sound One and commandeered a studio and Dominick and just kind of started weaving those 3 takes together.
But that's one of the best compliments I've ever gotten in my life, because Neil Young was like a hero of mine at the time. It was like the most amazing thing. I get to work with Neil Young, holy shit. But at one point, there was a really difficult music transition. It's like 2 pieces of music that just didn't want to go together. And I'm listening to it. I'm trying to figure out how to get from one to the other. So it's not that it has to be smooth or anything, but it doesn't jar and call attention to itself. And, so I'm working on it. And I finally get it to where that felt pretty good. And Neil Young goes, wow, that was really musical. And I'm like, oh, man, I am in fucking heaven. That was like, oh, man, the best compliment I've ever had in my life.
I mean, these are the kind of experiences that evolved in out of all the various things that all 3 of us have been talking about tonight. That openness to the creative process allowed those kind of things to happen, and that's why those movies are so special, and those soundtracks are so special musically and sound effects wise. There were intense moments, there were difficult moments, there were hard times, but that openness to the creative process and letting the creative process sort of sit on top of anything else that might be going on.
Even when it was really fraught, it was just very.
The most important thing is we make something
fraught.
Making something good.
It's kind of like, oh, that doesn't work. Let's try something different. It was about as contentious as it ever got. Which is just marvelous. And part of that was the fact that everybody just inherently trusted everybody else. And everybody was absolutely committed to the film and where we wanted to be with it.
I think that was palpable.
Yeah.
Everybody's commitment. And I think that was because of Jim. Everybody was committed to providing Jim with whatever he might need to weave something special out of a given movie.
I'll say one thing about Dead Man. I mean, I've mixed 300 something films, and out of every film I've mixed, there's only one film to this day that I would say Not that it's perfect or things couldn't be changed, but there's only one film that I'm totally satisfied with the soundtrack as released, and that's Dead Man.
I agree. It captures the moment of making
Absolutely.
it captures the moment of making
change
it.
a frame.
The Coffee and Cigarettes was a whole different animal because it was not conceived as a normal feature. We Jim shot one at one point. He shot a couple more at another point. Shot another one at another point. And one of the thoughts at that point was to do one sort of on the tail end of each feature, but things change and things then because he had this amazing opportunity. We did a music video for Tom Waits for the Red Hot and Blue Cole Porter tribute, and then kind of on the tail of that, he came up with this amazing idea for a Coffee and Cigarettes short with Tom and Iggy Pop. And then there was another sort of moment of downtime between two films where he shot two more, but then we never got around to cutting them. And then he decided he wanted to shoot another batch of them and flesh it out to a feature. So he and Fred Elms, a great DP, got together and shot the remaining batch of them, and we put them all together and made them into a little movie.
One of the other Coffee and Cigarettes vignettes was with Cate Blanchett.
And Cate Blanchett.
Yeah.
That was a beauty.
That was cool.
Oh, that was the thing of beauty. That was the thing of beauty. That was the only one I think that we shot 35 for the split screen effect. She played herself and she played her cousin. Shelley.
Yep.
And she was brilliant as both.
Right.
And really, definitely one of the more spectacular ones. I think when we were working on Broken Flowers, Jim told me that Bill Murray asked him, who played opposite Cate Blanchett in that as her cousin Shelley in that short film? And Jim was like, that was Cate. And Bill said, no, it couldn't be.
And she is like a chameleon. She really took on two personalities.
And the Cate half of that, she was very lovely and beautiful and wonderful. But Shelley was the shit. I know. Shelley was just great.
She was great.
But all of these were like just these, Jim had made a number of films, some of them more episodic than others. And here we had 11 different short stories, populated by the most amazing actors, all kind of written by Jim and performed by the most fantastic actors you could imagine. And it allowed for, it created an opportunity to see the sort of, I don't know about philosophy, but sort of like the poetry or the vision of Jim across all these stories. And when they did come together as one thing, you could see through them all what that was. To me, the most beautiful always was the last one.
Oh, that's right.
And how it just was Bill Rice and Taylor Mead and hearing something beautiful and feeling something beautiful in the music. And
who was the music was?
Mahler.
Mahler, right?
Yeah.
And he's listening. He's hearing it in his head.
He's hearing it in his head, and we are losing him. He is drifting off to the next plane of life.
Right.
He
dies.
Is going. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really pretty amazing.
Jim's brother Tom is in the background, sweeping up.
Right. Okay. Well, even with RZA and Bill Murray.
Yeah. Bill motherfucking Murray. That was very complicated. I think that was very difficult for Bill. He was complaining to Jim for a while after that every time his fans saw him on the street, they were like, Bill motherfucking Murray. And he was getting a little tired of that greeting every time they came up. But all these, that's the thing, the compilation of all 11 of them, it's really a beautiful example of somehow, and it created an opportunity for us, I think, in terms of picture editing and sound design and mixing to sort of just put it out there in a casual way. This is the sort of simple poetry of it all, and
simple poetry,
music and sound effects, and this kind of authenticity and realism part of it, and the poetic part of it, and somehow bringing those two together in a nice, natural way, and letting it play for itself.
Stay tuned for the next episode of Frame by Frame, which tells the story of Sound One, the nexus of the New York film industry from 1968 to 2011. This episode of Frame by Frame was produced by Isabel Sadurni and Ben Baker. The audio engineer was Tyler Newhouse for soundtrack. In New York, this is Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame.